Jorge, muito bom dia a todos. Quero agradecer ao Instituto Ethos para este convite e a oportunidade de participar em uma discussão com essa a presença dos meus amigos e colegas aqui, mas também com o professor Ignacy Sachs e o Sr. André. É incrível que vocês estão aqui o dia depois de participar em uma discussão como essa. If you allow me, I will continue in English. It's a little bit easier, but André, let me just say, I do admire that you're here this morning. It speaks to you as a person, it speaks to you as a professional, but it speaks to you as a person who cares. I think that is tremendous. It's a tribute to you. We often look at the planet as if we are sometimes on two different planets, but we have never lacked, I think, a common passion for what Carlos and George, you have invited us to discuss here this morning. The social contract. It's an interesting question. Do we need a new one? Well, the first assumption is the old one broken? And I think if you look at the state of our global discourse as a community of nations, but also as societies with one another, then I think the answer to this first question has to be yes. I think the social contract, or contracts you could even say, are either broken or are breaking up. If you go back, particularly to go to I think the notion that you used, Professor Sachs, which is the mega contract, I think you called it, the mega contract of the planet, which you associate with multilateralism and the UN, then clearly we had, after the Second World War, a new social contract. Now, contracts have sometimes the reality that not everybody who is affected by them necessarily signs them, but we had a post-Second World War social contract in the world which found its expression in the Charter of the United Nations, in the aspiration of the peoples of the world to find a better way to deal with differences, because differences are reality, and I think this is one of the things we must always accept. We will never be all the same, whether you describe it in economic reality or in cultural identity or in vision and social aspiration. But that social contract lasted maybe 20, 30 years, and I think in the 60s, and even into the 70s, the United Nations became a vehicle for progressive development, social and political policy making. It brought nations into a different discourse with one another and also within their own societies. It introduced not only the notion of human rights, but also the right to development and many other fundamental concepts that have shaped discourses, not only at the mega contract level, but also at the national level. But that contract began to erode already severely through the Cold War, and the United Nations became not necessarily the center where we search for common answers, but the place where we often play out the differences that exist between blocs, between nations. That whole era came to an end in 1992, or rather in the 1980s, and 1992, the Earth Summit, I think could be described as a new social contract that the world reached in 1992. It was a social contract that expressed itself in the notion of sustainable development. Now, some view that as a civilizational challenge, others define it in the formula of common but differentiated responsibility, and there already you see again, a contract has many clauses. And how do you reconcile the vision of those who look to the leaders of the world to challenge the inability to recognize and act on planetary realities, as our colleague Dr. Pachauri and the IPCC constantly are a reminder of, and perhaps one of the best antidotes where science challenges political inaction, even if it is in a cycle of assessments that takes time. But I think the story of climate change and science and politics on the planet is a very interesting case study of how this social contract works or does not work. But let us also be honest, we meet here in 2012, and the social contract of sustainable development of 1992 is breaking up, if not already broken. I saw a commentary yesterday in the paper, and interesting enough it was by a person who spent a lot of his time arguing that Rio should be about reaffirming the agreements of 1992, and then criticized that there are 59 citations of reaffirmation in the outcome document of 2012, and is that really enough? And here you see also, there is a oscillation, on uncertainty of what are we actually trying to do. Are we trying to protect the contract of '92? Or are we trying to evolve a new contract? Or do we have to make a completely new contract in this world? And I think this is where it gets interesting, because the question is, the contract that was made in 1948, in the 1950s, the contract that was negotiated in 1992 here, was between who and who? For what? Who was at the table? And whatever you might say about 1992 and its enormous power of guiding us in a common direction, the world is yet again changed in 2012. Not only in terms of North and South, in terms of economies of the South and emerging economies having become bigger, and economies in Europe on the verge of economic collapse with unemployment rates for young people at 50%. I mean, unimaginable realities right now that were inconceivable to many just a few years ago. At the same time, the emergence also of civil society as more than just a companion to the political decision-making process, but challenging the foundations of public decision-making. And also the fact that the corporate sector is, in one sense, at the center of controversy. In another sense, is also splitting into different strands. A number of corporate leaders here in Rio have to be recognized for having accepted that their role as corporate leaders and as corporations is no longer to just pay their taxes and get on with their business wherever they can practice it. Because perhaps they recognize that the social foundations of this contract are breaking up. Now you can be cynical and say, well, that's bad for business. Well, so what? If it's bad for business, it means business begins to think about how to do things differently. And I, again, want to cite, and I've done it often this week, Fabio Barbosa, who in such simple terms, when we awarded him the Champions of the Earth Award for being one of those business leaders who goes beyond just thinking about the business of today, said the business of business is sustainable business. It may not be the same agenda as that of Greenpeace or the Movimento Sem Terra, but it is still a part of, or let's say the parties that are part of the social contract of today. You cannot simply decree a contract top-down anymore in a summit. And that is also a tension that we have had to deal with. Does it challenge the sovereignty of the state and of elected governments? I'm not sure it does. But does it challenge perhaps the arrogance of past times that leaders simply get together and decide what is good for their peoples? Certainly. And I think that tension pervades Rio in 2012. Why is civil society organizing a summit in parallel and almost in deliberate separation from the summit that is taking place in Rio? This must tell us something is wrong in the way we view either the opportunity or the nature of this contract. But also, what is our contract about today? I believe that we are having the wrong conversations in these summits because they're missing the point of where societies are searching for common pathways forward. If you go back to a debate about sustainable development that says we want more development, less environment, or we want more environment and less social, or we want more women and less men, or we want more public ownership and less market, if we want less capitalism and more socialism, or it is Mother Earth and the Bolivarian approach to development versus the American and US approach of corporate capitalism. These are the polarities of our conversation today, but they don't offer us necessarily a way on which to connect the threads of different interests in a way that allows a social contract to emerge. I went to the Summit of the Peoples in order to have a conversation about the green economy and the concerns and the fears that have been articulated by some of the social movements with that concept. And to me it is fascinating how different an association we have when we talk about this concept. To me, Rio 2012 did deliver a progressive step in this discourse because I view it as critical that the environmental sustainability dimension is no longer kept in a parallel track, but enters the center stage of the development discourse which is dominated by economic paradigms. So if the green economy comes out of here as a core concept around which we have to work, then this is not about environmentalism somehow displacing social and developmental aspirations. It's about addressing something that went wrong after Rio. we said we had 3 dimensions of sustainable development, but what happened in the following 20 years was the same pattern of trade-offs being the equation. I'm being told my time is up, so let me simply conclude by saying 2 things. I've been trying to look for an image to describe the outcome document here, when I was thinking about social contract. Clearly, here in Rio in 2012, the world is unable to sign a new social contract. And I think Andre would agree with that. We all know that this is not our contract amongst the nations of the world, amongst the 7 billion people, with all the differences accounted for, and having achieved a set of common objectives and aspirations that are transformational. I disagree with those who say this document is devoid of content. I think they are wrong. If you look at this document, there is a lot in that document. But will it change the trajectory of sustainable development in the sense of a social contract? No. One analogy that occurred to me is that of a cookbook. You know, in the cookbook you have the recipes, you have the contents, and you have the instructions. If you look at the outcome document, it is, you know, a sort of half-written cookbook. Many ingredients are there. In some places it even has the quantities. It even gives you in some places a cooking time, but you don't have a whole recipe there. You also have not, in a sense, a whole menu written up. But in the cookbook that is not fully written, there is still a lot of information in there, and for many there is enough to work with in order to continue building perhaps the foundations for a new social contract. And another one is perhaps a more negative image, and that is, I think, the challenge of multilateralism today. It is like a chessboard on which the figures and the rules have been defined, and every move that you make on this chessboard today produces another tactical move from the other side. That was not the intent when the chessboard of the United Nations Charter was written almost 60 years ago. And I think we are at a point where the dynamics of multilateral negotiations are almost an arithmetic of negotiations, where every step is defined by the step of the other one, and we have lost sight of what the original idea of the chessboard was, which was to have a game together and to arrive not necessarily at the logic of chess, where one beats the other, but that we somehow elevate the prospect for a world to be able to work together. We need a new chessboard, and we are desperately looking for how to invent it.